Welcome everybody. Just to confirm that we are being recorded, I also want to let folks know, and I'll let you know at the end as well, that there's going to be a Zoom survey that pops up. That's our survey. So don't just ignore it because it's the Zoom. You think it's a Zoom survey. It's our survey, and it takes like 2 seconds to answer a few questions, but it will pop up like in your browser as a post presentation survey or post meeting survey. And we really appreciate it if you can fill it out. Welcome to today's Knowledge Thirsty Thursday, where we're talking about recovering from the holidays while in recovery or while not actively using substances. And just for clarification, that today substances includes, and a lot of the conversation that we're talking about today is centered around alcohol. So when we're talking about substances, it includes alcohol, but it also includes opioids or other substance use. I would like to acknowledge that I am situated on the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, as well as the Tsuut'ina and Îyârhe Nakoda. Everyone, as well as others who make their home in Treaty 7. Treaty 7 is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Battle River Territory, recently changed their name. You can learn about that on the Métis Nation of Alberta website. It's really interesting. And I encourage people to learn a little bit more about their the land that they're on and the history that they're on, because it's an important conversation, especially when we're talking about substance use as something that can be very intergenerational in terms of something that's passed down from our parents and our parents' parents, and a collective social trauma can very much influence our family coping skills. So it's something very much relevant to what we're talking about today, and that's why I think it's important to encourage folks to reflect on how colonization and connection to the land relates to not only topics discussion that we discussed today, but relates to how we live our lives and what we do day to day. I also want to let folks know that we are going to spend an hour together today talking about some heavy topics. If you find yourself having a response or having a reaction or a response to the topics discussed today, we encourage you to practice self-care and talk to people you trust. If you need additional supports, the Distress Center phone number is right there. I encourage you to take note. It's also super easy to Google, and I'm pretty sure it's 403-266-HELP. But that resource is available to you as well. We're going to be discussing topics of substance use, alcohol use. There are like some notes of some conversation around the 12-step program or the like abstinence-based programs. And then there'll be some other discussions around harm reduction and other conversation or other tips that people have experienced as helpful. So that's our agenda for today. We're going to go through some substance use trends. We're going to connect the dots to some of the reasons we might see these trends and the way that the pattern that they follow. And then afterwards, we're going to talk a little bit about how some tips from our lived experience, from people who have lived experience on how to kind of get through the holidays, since it is a really like intense time. If folks have any questions at any point, please do pop them in the chat and I will do my best to respond to them. I'm happy to, once the recording is over, have a little bit of a discussion, as well as folks can stick around or contact us after to have further conversations. Alrighty, we're gonna jump right into it. Based on the research that I did for this presentation, and as well as like some of the research that we use all the time. So for example, the Alberta smoking and alcohol use survey, as well as the surveillance data. We reference all the time. And looking at those, you can tell that like December is consistently one of the highest use, or whatever the study is showing, whether that be hospital visits, whether that be support services use, or whether that be like trends of use. It's December is consistently a high month. Other research I found that relates to just some of the context around like alcohol use as in Canada, being that like alcohol is the most common substance used in Canada. And December and January are the most dangerous times of year for drug and alcohol related death, especially when we're considering the research that says that a lot of poisonings are happening inside people's homes. A lot of times we have an idea of what substance use looks like, and it typically doesn't look like people in their home and using alone, or using without notifying anyone, and things like that. So especially around the holidays, if someone is living alone, we're going to talk about like reasons for why these patterns might show. But if someone is using alone, the rates of that use go up, and then therefore, since people are using in a private property alone, the risk for poisoning or death is high. Research also shows that drug overdose rates are about 22% higher during the holidays. That goes for like holidays that happen year round. Christmas and New Year's, though, account for the highest incidence of binge drinking, and December and January consistently are reported as the highest months in Alberta for reported poisonings. Of course, a lot of this data, when it comes to substance use and alcohol use, people aren't necessarily reporting or being honest about their use all the time, and so, or like the researchers are not able to reach out to certain people who have other barriers. So the data is always kind of like assumed to be a little bit higher. So really what this shows us is that alcohol use is very prevalent in Canada. It's prevalent amongst many people, amongst many different demographics, and also that during holiday seasons, the rate of use goes up. One reason that the researchers hypothesized is what they call like holiday blues, and this is a thing that people talk about very, very often. Is this concept of mental health rates decreasing in times where, especially during like December and January, holidays often center around conversation about like family traditions, about like, we get a potentially significant time off, so people who are living alone are isolated. So what studies that I found showed is that there's an increase in anxiety and depression, as well as loneliness and grief during the months of December and January. Mental health agencies across the board see an increase in service demand during the holiday months, and however, the hospital and psychiatric emergency services report a decrease in use over late December and early January. So it's interesting to see that like misalignment in that like the hospital and psychiatric emergency services are not necessarily being utilized at this time. However, people's mental health are decreasing. Their chances, or not chances, but their like anxiety and depression and their loneliness, those feelings are increasing, or are especially hard to cope with maybe during this time of year. I quoted one study here, but there were multiple studies that showed the same information, in that like specifically their loneliness, grief, and depression go up. But for many, anxiety around like gift giving or visiting relatives, all these things have it create a higher potential for folks to have an increase in anxiety and a decrease in their ability to cope with those things. And that's why we might see mental health agencies increase in support demand or in service demand, but hospital and psychiatric emergency services decrease. There wasn't any research that I found that like talked to that discrepancy. I think anecdotally, it's a very interesting observation. So when we connect the dots, what we see and what people often report experiencing is the stress of travel, the stress of shopping and gift giving, of stressful family dynamics, busy schedules, did I say travel? Comparative thinking and unrealistic expectations was consistently like the highest reported reason for why people might feel these like increase in mental illness or like decrease in coping skills. Comparative thinking and unrealistic expectations, especially around when we see like the media that's representing families around this time, even couples. There are so many Christmas movies that have the same cover of like a heterosexual white couple in red and green sweaters. And it's like the same storyline, right? So if we're not represented in that, if we're not feeling like we have an opportunity or like that we long for something like that, those feelings of comparative thinking in terms of like family tradition, having family, or what those families should look like, all of these like comparative thinking or unrealistic expectations is kind of what folks were touching on. I found a quote by an addiction specialist that said, many people look forward to the holidays, but for others, the time of year isn't as joyous and can be filled with painful reminders or sad memories. For folks who have lost somebody, who had a very active role in family dynamics, the holiday season can really highlight their absence. And then an additional anxiety was and obviously the anxieties are going to be different depending on environmental or like depending on each personal context. But for some, holiday shopping and overspending can be very anxiety inducing. Seasonal depression, especially in the cold, like today, staying indoors and being isolated can be a real hardship on people's substance use, especially if they don't have that social support network, right? For others, finding a place to stay while it's cold can be the bare minimum of anxiety, in terms of like, that's when our survival brain kicks in, and living in survival brain for long periods of time. And then again, during the holidays, that could potentially be highlighted, or additional stressors of this time can be really hard for folks who are thinking about other families or other people who have different circumstances than theirs. There's probably a lot of additional things we can add to this list. There are a ton of reasons why someone might experience a decrease in mental health. But what we do know is that these things, these stressors or these difficult feelings connect to people's substance use, or their potentially their ability to stay or to continue to not use their substances if that's their goal. So we know that a decrease in mental health, or that mental health and circumstance or environmental barriers are influential to people's substance use. So that's what connecting the dots here is really meant to show, that these are things that are reportedly felt during the holidays. And then when we also look at the statistics of increased substance use, we can see that these things might be related. Because we know that mental health and barriers to care influence someone's substance use. These are like very very notable observations that these two things are overlapping. I'm going to go into at this point the different options or some of the different models for care. While we only have an hour together, we're not going to get into like a ton of the pros and cons of each, but I encourage people to keep in mind while we go through these that how we can apply this thinking of holiday blues to what we're seeing, to what these models can do, and how we can and how the barriers to these programs or these services or models, I guess, would increase or be impacted by holiday blues. So one model of care is what we call harm reduction. This is what SafeLink operates under, and we define harm reduction as an umbrella term for many things, like the policy, strategies, and programs that focus on reducing the harms caused by social, medical, and environmental inequalities. And those things that influence how people engage in higher risk activities, specifically SafeLink's goals when we talk about things associated with sexual activity and substance use. So the graphic that we have here is kind of a sardonic representation of why some people feel that harm reduction doesn't work, that when we engage in risky activities, doing things to make those things safer encourages people to engage in water sports, like in this graphic. So we should ban life jackets because that means that people won't engage in doing risky activity on the water. But what the reality is that there are benefits to doing things on the water. And there are benefits to things like, or that we're still going to engage in these things, and that risk is an inherent part of life. And we can go about life thinking about how we can potentially decrease those risks. Things like helmets and sunscreen are also harm reduction. So when we apply that to substance use, there are many different types of models or different types of programs or services that can look like. It can be as simple as something like housing first, mental health supports, that social connection. So you can see that all of these types are examples of harm reduction services that go beyond abstinence-based models, or are just different or another option from abstinence-based models or methods, that these seek to find the root cause of somebody's like negative mental health consequences. And that could look like something like substance use, but it can also be, substance use can be the reason that they've gotten through, right? Those negative social contexts or circumstances. So things like social connection, when we talk about like holiday isolation, grief about missing, grief from missing family members, or comparative thinking and high expectations, we can see that like social support is one of the ways that might help someone to have additional coping skills that might not be substance use if that's their goal. So when we talk about like safe substance use supplies, that's things like clean needles or new needles, even like sharps containers, things like that. Safe substance use supplies being new and sterile supplies. even food service supports, these things like helping people access food, safe consumption sites and opioid agonist treatments are also ways that people might safe consumption sites being decreasing the risk to the risk of death to substance use. And we also see mental health support in that top right corner. And that really speaks to that correlation that we see, right? So these might not look like they are services, that they're all services for substance use, but they impact that because we know the correlation between mental health and substance use is so high. And while abstinence-based abstinence-based models or like rehabilitation services might work for some people, they don't work for all. And so for the people that those abstinence-based methods don't work, these might be options that work best for them. So how can we, what are the connections that we can make about holiday substance use and these models? What we often, what anecdotally I saw was that with an increase in mental health support, or if folks had further access to other options for support that might decrease things like isolation, or to be able to talk about the difficulties of holidays, holiday specific stresses with other people who are experiencing those same holiday stresses, that might help to support folks in this time that's very specifically that's very unique to other stresses that people experience. We're zooming through, so I hope folks are kind of keeping up with me, and if there are any questions that people have added them to the chat. I couldn't find any like specific, because there hasn't been research that has been dedicated to addressing holiday substance use. I can't say that I've seen, or in my research that I found, any research that specifically noted that some strategy was helpful for addressing holiday substance use, because I found statistics about holiday substance use and statistics about mental health during the holidays, and not many that connected those two. I mean, many hypothesized. But this is kind of presenting the different moving pieces here, and allowing folks to critically think about what how these things can apply. So our lived experience speaker was meant to be here for the second half of our presentation today. He couldn't make it, but they did send me some things that really worked for them. And what they said was, and when I did some research about other advice from people with lived experience, these were kind of some themes that I pulled from that. And this is mostly directly from our lived experience speaker, who was going to come, but a lot of the things that I found from other lived experience, folks with lived experience around like holiday substance use, and particularly people who were trying to maintain sobriety during their holiday stress, or during the months of December and January. And so I'd love to hear, we're going to go through them. I'd love to hear if there are some other things, or things that really clicked for people, or other things that people might add to this list. There's of course a exhaustive list of that, like every different things work for different people, right? So not all of these will work for everybody, but some additional things might be really helpful to folks. But what our lived experience speaker said, like, first of all, plan ahead and plan to connect with people that know about your sobriety, understand, and align with your values. So to make that accountability agreement potentially, so if you're going into family situations, for example, and you know that one person is a really big trigger, that maybe the person that is accompanying you to this family event can help you steer clear of that particular person. So that's something as an example of an accountability agreement that someone might make. But also to make an agreement to talk about any tough emotions that came up post holidays or post an event, or after any event. Talking through anything that came up and making sure that any lingering feelings get out is something that people often refer to. That's part of Plan Ahead, but one of the really, really big ones that our lived experience speaker recommended was to rehearse a response to someone offering a drink or someone questioning why they don't want to drink. Many people are very nosy and they ask a lot of questions that maybe you don't want to answer. So rehearsing a response like, no thanks, I'm not drinking right now, or no thanks, I have a drink already. They said that their number one go-to response was, I already have one. And so that comes down to our next point, which is props. To keep your hands busy with a non-alcoholic drink or some sort of fidget. They say that they use a fidget toy if they don't have like a cup of another beverage. They often encourage people to pour a non-alcoholic beverage into the same glass that the other people are drinking from, because it means people aren't necessarily going to offer them a drink if they look like they already got one. But they say they bring their water bottle with them everywhere, and that's what they will have in their hand. And it's particularly impactful to keep it in their hand because that means that nobody can put a drink in their hand. So keeping their hands busy is something that's really important for them. But other ways that you can plan ahead are to plan an exit strategy or an excuse to leave or something. Maybe your accountability buddy is actually someone who's not attending with you, but at 8 o'clock, they're gonna call you with an emergency and you gotta go. So planning that exit strategy in case it does end up being really tough. Some other tips in general being like knowing what your triggers are and doing everything you can to avoid those triggers. So saying no to attending certain events, maybe with people that are triggering. It's okay to say no to events. It's okay to say, actually, Ann Hilda is not my fave, super triggering. I'm not going to go to the events that she goes to. That leads into our next point, which is take it slow. Remember to have fun. Remember to do things that bring you joy or things that keep your mind occupied. Try a new activity maybe, or I know my friend suggested, or our lived experience speaker suggested, who is also my friend, so that's why. It suggested creating a game if you're going to a holiday event with family, and that family can be kind of awkward and weird sometimes, and that Ann Hilda makes really bad jokes. So every time Ann Hilda makes a bad joke, you high five your accountability buddy. Or something like that, making something fun out of any of those stressful events. But similarly, December and January is a long period of time. That's 2 months. So doing things that typically, like planning events or activities that don't necessarily include or have to include your substance, the substance that you struggle with. So things like tobogganing or ice skating, these are things or activities that maybe we can do that that keeps people busy and aren't necessarily associated with alcohol. One of the one of the studies that I found specifically related to New Year's Eve alcohol use, in that New Year's Eve particularly is a holiday that is centered around alcohol, and that participation in New Year's Eve means participating in bubbly or something like that. And staying up until midnight, and it's a holiday of having to say no, and assert boundaries if that's something that if those are activities that you don't participate in. So particularly folks who are trying to maintain sobriety from alcohol, New Year's Eve in particular can be difficult. So planning an activity specifically, planning activities that don't necessarily include alcohol, something like a game, or or even just planning not to stay up till midnight, but planning something earlier in the evening, can help, especially because staying up late is often associated with drinking, and for some, staying up late is in and of itself a bit of a trigger. So planning activities, or different types of different ways to celebrate can be a helpful way to limit those triggers, but also maintain that celebratory feeling and the celebrating the new year. And especially for folks who may be counting their sobriety, the new year can be a really amazing time to celebrate that. So celebrating by going to a meeting and talking about your successes is one of the things our lived experience speaker said works for them. Again, like, a meeting might not be the structure that everyone feels comfortable with, but celebrating wins, celebrating of some sort, and maintaining that aspect of fun is something that I think is really important and something that everybody deserves. And lastly, we have practice self-care. Don't be afraid to ask for help and seek support if needed, and have grace with yourself. This is a really hard time of year for many people. And similar to like celebrating your wins, things like not overcommitting can be a really really good preventative technique, or a preventative a way to like assert your boundaries before you're put in a situation where it might be harder to assert those boundaries. And again, like, practicing self-care, it's a pretty like cliche tagline now, but it can look like many different things, including seeking mental health supports. It can include seeing your therapist, or going to a meeting, or meeting up with someone who you talk about your sobriety with, or reasserting your boundaries before you go to any event. Whether you are very open about your substance use or not, for some people, not talking about it or not paying attention to it is important, and for others, being very, very clear about the fact that they're sober and that other people need to respect that. Those are two very different ends of a spectrum, and that means that planning ahead especially is going to be different for each of those people. So they said that rehearsing a response was one of the like biggest, our lived experience speaker being the person I'm referring to, said that was one of the biggest things for their own sobriety like story, was to have a bit of a rehearsed blurb about, or how to respond to awkward situations where you have to draw boundaries. Practicing your boundaries and practicing word for word drawing those boundaries, revolutionary, at least to me. But yeah, there are many other things that people might have for this list, and this part was meant to be a little bit more of a conversation, so that's why we're ending like 20 minutes early. We're not ending it yet, but I'm at the end of my presentation because this is meant to be a conversation with lots of folks. So if other folks have other things that these tips reminded them of, or if they have any like additional things to add, I encourage you to throw it in the chat or unmute yourself now. We can also end the recording and then have a discussion. But before that, I want to remind people that we have a post-workshop survey and that is going to pop up when our Zoom meeting ends. The direct link to the survey will pop up, so don't ignore the Zoom survey. Also, the feedback is very much appreciated and needed. But otherwise, thank you. This is our contact information for folks who folks who maybe want to contact us for any of those, any services that that we offer, and as well, if you have any questions or anything that you want to continue to talk about this subject, then you can contact us here and we can continue this conversation. I'm gonna leave the slide up just for a few minutes to see if there's anyone who wants to have conversation while the recording is on, and then we can end the recording and continue the conversation if we want to. But okay, I'm gonna end the recording, and we can continue or not. Based on if folks have additional comments. Thank you.